Hello, everyone, and welcome. Okay, I got it. Recording's in progress. Thanks, Todd. So trauma in the brain, lately in education within the last few years, trauma has really become a sort of buzzword that we use. But what does it really mean? And what are the things that we're going to see in our students who have experienced trauma? And what is the mechanism in the brain that causes us to see these behavioral effects? So I'm just going to run through this. And if you have questions, you are free to email me. I'll share my email address with Todd so he can send it out later. So trauma in the brain. First of all, we really have to define what is trauma. For our purposes, not those, there we go. Acute trauma is described as a one-time event in a normal lifetime. It's short in duration. It can be severe. It might be accompanied by injuries or loss. It results from three categories, typically medical trauma, natural disasters, and human-made disasters. So some examples would be a car accident, a hurricane, a mass shooting, fire, or disease outbreak. These are traumatic events that can cause physical and emotional damage, like PTSD, but don't necessarily change the structures of the developing brain. Where we're going to focus is chronic trauma. These are defined as repeated anticipated events with persistent exposure. So some examples would be neglect, war, repeated child abuse, repeated exposure to violence, multiple transitions and losses, and poverty. Exposure to chronic trauma in childhood changes brain structures and functions and can have a profound impact on development. It has lifelong ramifications, and it can even change gene expression, which we'll talk about. It's called epigenetics. These are effects that are proven by scientific studies. These aren't just the latest and greatest in education. So before we dive into how trauma can affect the brain, we need to talk about how the brain develops. So the brain develops back to front, with the oldest part of our brain, or the reptilian brain, your instinctual or survival brain, developing first. This is really responsible for all of your autonomic functions like breathing, functions we don't have to think about. The limbic brain begins developing around 3 months in utero. This is our emotional brain. The two main structures are the amygdala, which is responsible for our fight or flight response, and our hippocampus, which is responsible for memory. The neocortex, or our rational or thinking brain, develops last. And that really doesn't start to develop until adolescence, which is around 9 for the brain, and doesn't finish until about the mid-20s. So we talk about the developing brain. We talked about how your brain developed. So you have the synapses in your brain, or how your brain communicates, how parts of your brain communicate. At birth, you're born with a certain number of neurons, which grow tremendously during the first 5 years of life, and everything is experiential. So any experience a baby has during the first 5 years of life help increase that synaptic density. By the time you reach about elementary age, you probably have the most synapses you will ever have in your whole life, because you've basically learned how to be a human up until that point. When you hit puberty, which for the brain, again, is around 9 years old, you go through this process called synaptic pruning. And it is where old connections will start dying off, to make way for new connections, for a stronger, faster brain that will help you survive into adulthood. So the craziness of adolescence or the teenage years really can be summed up by the synaptic pruning process, and a little bit by the hormones. So you can imagine a child that comes into your classroom as a kindergartner who didn't have a lot of experiential exposure from birth to age 5. And so they're coming in with significantly less of those, significantly smaller synaptic density. And so by the time they hit puberty, even more, their old connections are dying off, but they didn't have a ton to begin with. So it can't explain why we see some behavior spikes in our students that are in the middle school ages. So how this all kind of came about, or how we started learning about adverse childhood experiences and how trauma can impact brain development. Back in the 80s, Dr. Vincent Folletti ran an obesity clinic in California. And as part of his work, he ran a program to help his patients lose weight. Many of his patients would drop out of the program. And Dr. Folletti sort of began digging through the data to figure out why. Why were some of his patients dropping out? He found out that many of his patients had not gained weight slowly over the years. They all had a normal birth weight and gained weight rapidly at some point in adulthood. He began asking his patients a series of questions to see if he could pinpoint the cause. His breakthrough came through when he asked one patient, how much did you weigh when you were born? How much did you weigh in first grade? And then he asked, how much did you weigh the first time you became sexually active? And his patient responded, 40 pounds. She said she was 4 years old and it was with her father. So he kept asking these types of questions with his patients, and all of these patients had similar stories of physical abuse. So eventually he ended up partnering with Dr. Robert Anda, and they did this huge study, 17,000 participants through the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, which is a huge hospital network in California. And we'll talk more about the results of this study, but out of this study came this sort of breakthrough in science on how chronic exposure to trauma in childhood can change brain structures and impact behavior and long-term outcomes for life. All right, so what are adverse childhood experiences? The study that Dr. Folletti and Dr. Anda did really was focused on 10 areas. So really anything that can cause chronic trauma over a period of time for a child can be considered an adverse childhood experience. They really fall into three categories: adverse childhood experiences, adverse community experiences, and adverse climate experiences. ACEs are chronic trauma, which affect brain structures and have long-term impacts on health. So the 10 categories I was talking about: physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, household dysfunction, living with somebody who has a mental illness, having an incarcerated relative, seeing your mother treated violently, substance abuse in the home, and divorce. So these early adversity experiences have long-term impacts. They affect opportunities for education, income, and occupation. They increase high-risk behaviors like alcohol and drug abuse, unsafe sex, and opioid misuse. They can lead to chronic diseases like cancer, diabetes, and heart failure. They increase your risk for infectious disease, like for HIV and STDs. They can impact maternal health, which leads to unintended pregnancy complications, and even fetal death. Increased risk for depression, anxiety, and suicide, and increased risk for injury, traumatic brain injuries, fractures, and burns. So how do ACEs, chronic trauma, and toxic stress sort of link together? So I want you to imagine a child, if we're looking at the child on the top who's born, and their childhood experience is one of danger. So their brains develop to survive, right? They have a heightened sense of fight, flight, or freeze. They really are in survival mode. And they're sort of built to survive the worst conditions. They really are the ones that can survive sort of any of the crazy, stressful conditions that happen. But they really don't do great in the classroom because they go through this experience. They come into our classrooms and they are built for survival, and we want them to sit in a chair, walk in a straight line, follow directions. And then we have another child who's born into safety and security. That's their childhood experience. And so their brain adapts for working with people, for processing situations, and just they have a world of possibility. They tend to survive the best conditions, but they're vulnerable at the worst conditions. So adverse childhood experiences essentially lead to toxic levels of stress hormones in the body and the brain. These toxic stress levels generate predictable patterns in brain development. When stress chemicals are elevated for long periods of time in the brain during development, they can be damaging to neurons. Humans are really only made to be under stress for about 20 minutes at a time, long enough for the body to prepare for flight, fight, or hide, or freeze. But when your brain is marinating in those toxic stress chemicals, like cortisol, it really does impact how your brains develop. All right, so when we have a child whose biology and brain adaptations collide with social expectations, that's where we run into trouble in the classroom. So we're going to kind of walk through, and I'm going to slow it down because, man, I'm blasting through this. How do we know the effects of maltreatment? How do we know what types of maltreatment impact brain development at certain times? So Dr. Martin Teicher is a researcher out of Harvard, and he isolates one factor at a time. So one adverse childhood experience at a time when studying human brain and biology. His research has determined that maltreatment affects brain development in predictable ways, and not all experiences generate the same effect. There are 3 variables that will determine the effects of maltreatment: the type of maltreatment, the gender, and the age at the time of maltreatment. And when I say gender, that's gender assigned at birth. So there are periods of development in the brain, right? We talked about how the brain develops back to front, it develops sequentially. And during this time, you develop age-appropriate capacities. There are sensitive periods for each brain region when experience has greater effect. So we'll talk about the limbic system first. This is really your fight or flight emotional reward memory system. It's vital for learning, memory, reward, and reinforcement, and it regulates your hormones, your mood, your heartbeat, and your sexual behavior. It is responsible for our fight or flight response. 2 important components of your limbic system is your hippocampus and your amygdala. These are vital for relationships. Your amygdala signals the release of fight or flight chemicals, and the hippocampus signals the recycling of these chemicals. Your hippocampus is also responsible for memory and social cues. Together, they regulate panic and fear and help put the brakes on emotional outbursts. So when is the limbic system vulnerable to the effects of maltreatment? This area is particularly susceptible to all forms of maltreatment in the first 3 years of life, and to sexual abuse the first 5 years of life. At birth, and this is the mechanism for all of the damage that happens, or all of the brain development challenges that you have when experiencing chronic trauma. So at birth, the hippocampus has these seedling cells that are programmed to activate, grow, and mature around puberty. The stress hormone cortisol, which is a stress hormone that's released when you're feeling that fight or flight response, is deadly to these seedling cells, so it kills them off. The effects of this type of maltreatment we might not see on that area of the brain, won't be seen for 9 to 13 years, right around puberty, when the seedling cells fail to grow and produce the brain mass needed for specialized functioning. Kind of an example of this is a few years ago, it might have been 10 years ago, there was a woman who had adopted a child from a Russian orphanage. And everything was fine until the kid hit puberty, and then she'd like put him on a plane and tried to send him back to Russia. But really, I mean, not appropriate. But what had happened to this child is he, in the first few years of his life, when she adopted him as a toddler, he had experienced this maltreatment, and his brain, didn't develop in the way that it was supposed to, but you didn't see the effects until he had hit puberty. All right, the cerebellar vermis. This is responsible for your positive feelings, perception, and attention. And it also sort of controls addiction, attention problems, and mental illness. It orchestrates attention, mental health, and navigation through physical space, and it connects the 2 halves of your cerebellum. It also has, like the limbic system, it also has seedling cells, and these cells are vulnerable to toxic levels of cortisol. The vermis is sensitive to all forms of maltreatment before puberty, and the symptoms might not emerge until early adulthood. This area of the brain really is the seat of mental health and has a role in virtually every mental illness. All right, this is exciting. The corpus callosum. It connects the left and the right side of the brain. Right-left brain communication is vital for complex thought and movement. I'll go back. Sorry. The left hemisphere is responsible for spatial patterns, math calculation, and fact retrieval, grammar and vocabulary processing, routine situations. The right hemisphere is visual and auditory processing, prosaic language, facial perception, and processing new or novel situations. The corpus callosum is the superhighway that connects the 2 halves of the brain, and each hemisphere is specialized to control movement on the opposite side of the body. So if somebody has a stroke on the right hemisphere of their brain, you will see the effects on the left side of the body. Each hemisphere is responsible for processing certain types of information, and the corpus callosum really is the part of the brain we use to process story problems in math, because we're using new language, we are calculating math. So the communication between the 2 halves of our brain needs to be on point. So when is the corpus callosum vulnerable to maltreatment? Exposure to neglect in infancy for boys and exposure to sexual abuse for girls around the ages of 9 and 10 have powerful impacts on this area of the brain. The maltreatment disrupts the electrical activity, which makes cross-brain communication less reliable. So we talked about the synaptic pruning and synaptic density. That really is how your brain communicates. So damage to this area of the brain when it's developing really does impact that cross-brain communication. Less cross-brain communication can lead to an inability to integrate rational ideas when in a highly emotional state. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the original ACEs study. This was 17,000 study participants that were in this study over a series of like 10, 15 years. The people in the study were mostly white and had access to very good health care. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we're looking through the data of the study. Okay, so before we kind of dive into it, I want to explain the pathway and how experiencing these early childhood experiences, these adverse childhood experiences, can impact over the lifetime. So this is the ACE pyramid, and it shows how the effects of adverse childhood experiences build upon each other and can lead to early death. So we talked about how our brains adapt to survive the environment in which we live in, right? We talked about that. An example would be smoking is an adaptive behavior. Nicotine can reduce symptoms from depression and anxiety. So you have historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, intergenerational adversity, and that really is what your parents experienced, you will experience. That's neurodevelopment and epigenetic influences, and I will talk about it. I have a story for epigenetics next. Then on top of that, you put adverse childhood experiences, and these are all of the negative things you experience in childhood chronically that will impact brain development. And that in turn causes you to create adaptations in the brain, right? And behavior in brain, which lead to challenges with social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, which can lead people to have higher health risk and behaviors, which can lead to disease, disability, and social problems, which can lead to early death. All right, so explaining what epigenetics is. Here's a good example. So in September of 1944, trains into and out of the Netherlands stopped. Dutch railway workers hoped to stop the transportation of Nazi troops and help the Allied troops. When that effort failed, the Nazis punished them by blocking food supply routes, which put much of the country into famine pretty quickly. By May of 1945, 20,000 people had died of starvation. It was a unique experiment. I mean, the doctors who looked at the experiment, when I talk about it, was very unique because it was such a short period of time. So it was September of 1944 to May of 1945. So it was just this very specific period of time. But it really offered a view into how stressful experiences can impact development. So women who were pregnant during this time gave birth to children who grew up to be overweight, have higher cholesterol, and who experienced higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and schizophrenia. There was a 10% increased mortality rate in Dutch hunger winter babies. So these were babies that were in utero during this time. And there is a link to the article, and I know Todd will share out the presentation, but you can look up Dutch hunger winter. So to kind of explain this and how this works, right? So the women were pregnant, they had experienced this significantly stressful, physiologically stressful time. And because their bodies were starving, it turned on some gene in their children to hold on to more fat. So they were more overweight, they had higher cholesterol, they had higher rates of obesity, which is kind of crazy, but then you see those long-term impacts. And this is just like I don't know, this is not really a fun fact. This is not really fun, but this is just a piece of information to kind of think about when we think about genetic influences on how chronic trauma can impact, genetics. For people born female-bodied or assigned female at birth, their ovaries, when they're born, contain all the eggs they will ever have. So they're developed when they're in utero. So in puberty kickstarts the ovulation process. So essentially, I don't know how else to say this, it doesn't sound weird, like the grandmother is housing the eggs of their grandchildren or their future grandchildren. They're housing their future grandchildren. So that's really how you can see those sort of long-term epigenetic influences. All right, so now we're going to get away from the weird and talk about the ACEs study. So this, all of the information I'm going to talk about now really has to do with this specific study that they did. Remember, 17,000 participants, mostly white, access to really good healthcare. So when you're thinking about the student populations that you work with or your community demographics, what might that look like in your community? So of these 17,000 participants, 27% experienced substance abuse in the home, 23% had their parents separate or divorce, 17% lived with somebody who had a mental illness when they were a kid, 13% of them had mothers who were treated violently, and 6% experienced criminal behavior in somebody who lived in the home. 15% experienced emotional neglect, 10% physical neglect, 11% emotional abuse, 28% physical abuse, and 21% experienced sexual abuse. ACEs are highly interrelated. They're co-occurring. Where one ACE occurs, there are usually others, right? If you're experiencing physical abuse, you might also be experiencing emotional abuse. And most of the time, 80% of the time, they occur together. So you won't typically just see one. So again, this is the study. ACE scores really do reliably predict challenges during the course of life. The clinically significant number of adverse childhood experiences is 4 or more. And that really is when you start to see the big impacts over lifespan. So in this study, 33% had no ACEs. They had no adverse childhood experiences. They had no adversity. They grew up with no adversity. 26% had 1, 16% had 2, 10% had 3, and 16% experienced 4 or more ACEs. There is a dose response relationship, which is why when you hit 4 or more, you start to see a huge impact, a huge increase on the impacts that you'll see over a lifetime. And really what a dose response relationship is, the more you're exposed to something or the greater quantity that you're exposed to something, more that you will see the impact or the effects. It's really like, if you think about taking medication, right? Antibiotics is a good example. Like you have to take all 10 days of them or your doctor will light you on fire. But it really is that dose response relationship. You have to tip the balance to where you have enough of the antibiotic built up in your system that it starts to fight off the infection. So really what you see is the higher your ACE score, the more likely it is, the higher percentage that you will experience health problems as you get older. Autoimmune diseases are a big one. So women are already at a higher risk to experience females assigned at birth are already predisposed to experiencing a higher rate of autoimmune diseases. That rate triples when their adverse childhood experience score is over 4. All right, so ACEs and depression. This again is that 17,000 study participants. Even at a baseline, women are always higher than men for study purposes as far as experiencing depression. And yeah, okay. So even without any ACEs, you know, it's still about 15% of our population in general as a whole that experiences depression. When you get to 4 or more, 60% of women in this study expressed experiencing depression, and about 40% of men. All right, for adverse childhood experiences and suicide attempts, for all populations of gendered populations within this study, for those that it had 4 or more ACEs, they had almost 20% of them had made a suicide attempt. So I always kind of trip over this in trying to explain what a population attributable risk is. So this is an estimate, okay? So based on various studies that have happened over the years, scientists have estimated what can we attribute to adverse childhood experiences in alcohol and binge drinking, right? If we're using that one as an example, 32.5% of people that struggle with alcohol and binge drinking have experienced adverse childhood experiences. Asthma, which I thought was a really interesting one. For anyone who has attempted suicide, this is obviously not suicide completion, this is attempted suicide. Anyone that's attempted suicide, 67% of them had a clinically significant adverse childhood experience number. So these are just estimates, but this really is, you know, how are we how are we as a society working with our children early to help them build those resiliency skills so they don't see as many of the impacts. So I just mentioned resiliency. So kids are very resilient, but absolutely not in isolation. They don't just bounce back. We are pushing against biological systems, right? And adaptations that they have in their brain and behavior. So really the way that we can nurture healthy development in our students and of these protective systems for us as educators, for you as educators, is in that attachment and belonging. Relationships with caring and competent people are vital contributors to resiliency and recovery in our students or in anyone who's experienced chronic trauma as a child. Relational trauma is healed through positive relationships in childhood. So this was supposed to be an hour. I apologize, I talked very fast. So I will just touch on what does this have to do with managing behavior in our students? Like, we can have all this information, we can have all this knowledge about this is what's happening to our kids when they're coming in, but at the end of the day, how are we helping them? How are we making our jobs a little bit easier by creating systems to support what their brains are going through? I don't know if anybody has struggled with anxiety. Very obviously I am, because I'm having a panic attack right now. And my Fitbit says I'm in the heart rate zone. I also have heartburn, by the way. But you know, when you come in, and for anybody that's experienced anxiety, when you're having that moment, your brain is perceiving a threat, whether it's real or not, it doesn't matter. Your brain perceives that you are being threatened, your life is being threatened. And so your body will physiologically react to that threat. Your brain will start releasing those fight or flight chemicals. So those chemicals will increase your heart rate. They will open up blood vessels to get more blood to your muscles to run or fight, right, from the danger. It will shut off communication to your prefrontal cortex. So people that are in a highly emotional state or experiencing severe anxiety, you won't be able to talk them out of it because their brain can't even process words, right? They can't process communication. So how do we create preemptive systems or systems to put into place before our kids even come into the classroom, and we're building those relationships so we can reduce the amount of time that we're spending managing those behaviors as it relates to trauma. So trauma really does live in the body, kind of through that system that I talked about. It impacts your brain and body and causes your nervous system to stay on high alert. So again, anyone that's experienced anxiety, you have a highly sensitive fight or flight response. And so you're always ready to face the next threat, whether it's a real threat or a perceived threat. The trauma is not physically held in the bones or the muscles. It's instead the need to protect yourself from perceived threats. And it's stored in your memory and emotional centers of your brain, your limbic system, your hippocampus, and your amygdala. This activates the body whenever it reminds the person of a traumatic event, whether it's conscious or not. And I actually do have time to tell a story after this is over. I know you're really excited about that. Okay, so many people continue to feel the effects of trauma known as post-traumatic stress for years after an event, years. And it might show up in the body as feeling easily overwhelmed, feeling on edge, muscle tension, chest tightness, trouble sleeping, having nightmares. There's memory issues. You will frequently see memory issues because the limbic system is the memory center of the brain. And that is where your fight or flight response comes from, right? Amygdala, hippocampus. Frequently, you will see kids that have experienced chronic trauma struggle with memory well into adulthood. Brain fog or trouble focusing, anxiety and avoidance, depression and disassociation. So for those of you that have attended Focus on Inclusion or are familiar with Dr. Terrence Scott, he really defines behavior as specific actions rather than general descriptions of personality or comportment. So if we're thinking about behavior in a trauma-informed way and understanding that these are biological responses that people are having or that our students are having, then as educators and humans, right, we take behavior very personally, and we will often blame the challenging behavior on a condition, right? They have ADHD or they're ODD, or it's culture, right? It's implicit bias. We don't maybe consciously say that because a student is a different color from us or were raised in a different way that they might behave in a certain way, but that might be how our brain perceives a situation. But if we think of challenging behaviors as actions, right? This is a response to something the child has experienced. How can we change the environment? Then those positive behaviors, or those things that we want to see them engage in, can be taught, modeled, practiced, and mastered. So kind of three big things that I always think about. All behavior is communication. The student might just not know what they're communicating or what they need to communicate. And then anybody who's a Dr. Ross Greene fan, kids do well if they can and if they have the skills to meet the expectations. Simply put, behavior is the effect of learning within the environment. Okay, so when you're building relationships, that's really what it comes down to, building relationships with your students. You want to set love-based limits and boundaries, right? They need to have boundaries. Think Mr. Rogers and General Patton. We've got to have those boundaries in place. We have to have rules and expectations. We have to have social norms for how we behave in our classroom together, but we're going to do it with love and not in a punitive way. Demonstrate a forever commitment. Communicate the message that I will never give up on you. I might not like the way you're acting or the things that you are doing, but I'm not giving up on you. Take time to have closure with a student, and stop stigmatizing students because of behavioral or mental health issues. It's not their choice, and they oftentimes don't have control over how they behave because of this. Hold regular family meetings. It's a best practice. If you're holding team meetings in your classroom or family meetings with your small groups and you're just checking in, you are creating patterned experiences for kids where they know what to expect when they come to see you, because the same thing happens every time. Establish traditions, smile and be authentic. I always tell people it's okay to like kids and it's okay to show them that you like them. It's not going to make them behave worse if you don't. Welcome students into the room or school, like, hey, welcome. I'm really happy to see you today. We know that some of our most challenging kids are the ones that come to school every day. Like, they are never absent, but welcoming them regardless of how they're going to act with us, walking them into the classroom, walking them into the school, being genuinely happy to see them, and ask students what they need. Teaching our students self-advocacy skills is extremely important, but sometimes they can say, hey, this is what I need from you. So with that super speedy presentation, I will close and I will I'll wrap it all around with a story. So when I was a teacher, I was a self-contained teacher for students with emotional disabilities, and I did 5th through 8th grade, and then I also did high school, like later on. So my 5th through 8th grade class, I had 12 students, and these are students who had been in a general education setting, but because of behavior or whatever, they were sent to me, and my classroom was in a separate building for students with emotional disabilities or students who didn't have emotional disabilities but struggled with behavior. So we were totally separated from general education setting. And so I had 5th through 8th grade students. It was great to manage. We really ended up being like a small family. So I tried very hard to build relationships with my students. So I had this one student, and we'll call her Peggy. And I hope I remember that name because I just made that up on the spot. Anyway, Peggy had come to me in 4th grade. She had experienced a ton of trauma at home. I mean, her life was a mess. She had been sexually abused. She had been physically abused, emotionally. I mean, everything that could possibly happen to a kid happened to this girl. One of the things that she always came to school dirty. I mean, she was never clean. And one of the other things she would do is she would bring absolutely everything that she valued in life in her backpack to school every day. Like that backpack with her stuff, she was afraid to leave it at home, was her world. So she carried it everywhere. I made sure that I respected that. I didn't ever touch her backpack. I didn't ever ask to see things in it. Like, that was hers. That was sort of like her safety that she carried around. It probably took me, oh my gosh, 2 years to build a really, really good relationship with her. It just took a very long time. And because of the way that my classroom style, right, or the way that, I had the self-contained classroom, I had the ability to spend that time building that relationship with her because I had her for multiple years. So we finally got to a point, right? We did things like, I gave her a special designated safe space for her backpack in the classroom. I wouldn't touch it. It was behind my desk. It was like in a little cubby, but she knew that it was safe there because nobody else could reach it. It was behind my desk. So she would come in the morning and put it away, and then she'd go shower. We had a gym with a locker room that had a shower. So she would go down, I'd give her fresh clothes. She would go down to the locker room. I would stand guard at the door on the outside so she could take a shower, and she would be in there for an hour, but I'm not going to begrudge a poor kid an hour-long hot shower. And so she would call out to me periodically to make sure I was there and preventing anyone from coming in. And I would just check in with her. And then, we would go about our day. So the way that we ran the classroom to manage having, 5 different grade levels with various students in there to try to get through all the material is I ran stations. So there would be a station with me where they'd learn the core content of whatever we were teaching or reteaching. They'd work with the para in the room. They'd rotate to the para in the room to either work on homework or to practice skills. And then they would rotate to like an independent study area where they could work on skills on the computer or whatever. So we had a great system, and I was so happy. And Aurora was really loving math. We started the day off with math, and then we went to language arts. I wanted to get all the tough stuff out of the way right away in the morning, because if we know anything about kids and stamina with their behavior, like at some point it devolves and they lose their minds in the afternoon. So it was going great. And then one day, probably, this was maybe November, right? In her 6th grade year. So we were into year 3. She started to do some of her old behaviors. She came to sit down at math, which again, after our morning meeting, breakfast and our morning meeting, it was our first subject. And she started breaking pencils kind of out of nowhere. And I'm, just initially watching and kind of not commenting and whatever. But as the week kind of got on, her behaviors got progressively more aggressive or avoidant. So she would do things like, we would start math, we would be going, and then she would stop talking and then hide under the table, or rip up her paper, or break up her pencils and whatever. It got really bad, probably about 2 weeks into November. She would start blowing up the classroom, and it would be the minute she would come in, and then she would stop getting off the bus. Like, she wouldn't even come into school. And I am extremely frustrated at this point. Remember, we take behavior very personally. I'd spent 2.5 years building a relationship with this kid. She wouldn't talk to me. None of the tricks that I had in my bag were working. I could not bring her around. And it sort of culminated in this event where one day she does come to the classroom, but she's sitting at her desk with her backpack on her lap, and she's got her arms crossed, and she's just looked really angry. And this was probably, I'm assuming, I think it was on a Friday, and my nerves are shot and I'm just kind of done. And I kind of get in her face a little bit and I say, Peggy, that was the made up name, Peggy, it's time for math. And I need you, right? Because I love using that language. I need you to get up and walk yourself over to the math table and sit down and participate in math. And she just shut down, not speaking, not anything. And I hounded her, which was not an appropriate response at all. I was taking it very personally. I was actually kind of angry at her. And she got up and ran out of the classroom, and then she ran out the door to the building, and then she ran down the street. And so I'm kind of speed walking, chasing her with my walkie-talkie, like yelling after her a little bit, like, please slow down. Like, I'm so mad at this point because I'm just watching years of work unravel in front of me. And I chased her like 2 miles to the library. And we had to call the cops because she walked off the school premises, and the cops stop us in the library parking lot, and she just collapses on the ground and she starts sobbing. And at this point, like, I'm near tears, right? And I'm like, Peggy, why did you run? What is going on with you right now? Like, I'm just so frustrated, right? And she said, Ms. Brander, I hate that book. And I'm thinking, I don't know what I'm thinking. I'm not thinking about a book. I'm thinking it's math, or it's, she's got all these avoidant behaviors. She doesn't want to try anymore, whatever it is. So I'm like, what book? What are you talking about? Like, I can't even, like, we're in the library parking lot. Is she talking about some book at the library? Is that why we're here? Like, I couldn't even wrap my mind about it. And so she said, like, that, it's that book that we're reading in class. I hate it so much. And so then it was like, I don't know if you've ever had this moment where just like realization washes over you. And you can feel it in the pit of your stomach, and it's just nauseating. So what she was talking about was, right after math, we had reading. And all of the sixth graders in our district read a book called Surviving the Angel of Death. I was so excited to get my sixth graders to read this book because they were never on grade level content. And we had actually were able to order the books. And I mean, it was great. We were like a regular classroom. Well, Surviving the Angel of Death is a book by Eva Cord. I don't know if anybody's familiar with her. She had a Holocaust museum called Candles down in Terre Haute. She's passed away, but she was a twin who was experimented on by Josef Mengele during the Holocaust at Auschwitz. And so we're reading about her experience, which is age appropriate, written age appropriate, but I'm reading this book to a kid who had been locked in a closet and wasn't able to get out to use the bathroom, wasn't given food, like she was tortured. And so here I am re-traumatizing her during this experience by reading her this book about these kids her age that are being tortured. So I did not keep it mindful, the trauma that she experienced. I had been re-traumatizing her. I got mad at her for damaging our relationship. Like everything that I had learned and done as a teacher sort of came crashing down because I didn't use any of the skills that I had. So the point of that story really is we can't take behavior personally. We really have to look at all the causes because we don't know. And I'm very fortunate that in that moment, she was able to articulate to me what the cause of all that was. It took us a really long time to repair that relationship. Had I been more trauma informed and aware and even paid attention to the content and the things that I was reading to her and looked at the pattern and noticed, she always blew it up at math time, but that really was so she could get out of reading. So she didn't have to participate in reading. And she hadn't for weeks because she blew everything up in math time and was in the principal's office before reading even started. So yeah, that's that story. So just in closing, use the information that you have about your students, build those solid relationships, but with boundaries, and then just be mindful when you see those changes in behavior to look at the patterns, look at the data, when is it happening? What are the things that are happening in the environment? What is the student gaining access to or avoiding by engaging in those behaviors? And then how are the things that they've experienced or they are currently experiencing impacting the way that they function within the classroom? So that's it. That's all I got. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble for 45 minutes. And I'm going to pass it back to Todd.
Thank you, Lindsey. We appreciate all that information. It's huge in understanding student behavior and how kids really want to do well if they can, but we can miss that sometimes and don't understand the connection. So Lindsey, that story at the end was extremely helpful in kind of understanding this connection. I'm sorry if y'all hear weird noise in the background. I've got a pug on the floor who is snorting. Thanks again for joining us. I'm going to put an exit ticket into the chat right now. Please make sure you fill this out so that you can get your PGP certificate from me. And I will send that within the next couple of weeks. We also want to make sure that you are able to give us feedback. We're still planning one more session for this year. We've got several more sessions and I'll share those with you. But we also are continuing to look at one session that we need to fill and want to make sure that we get your feedback. So here is a QR code, and I'm hoping everybody can see that okay. Nope.
No, it's not there.
What about now?
Yep, now it is.
Okay. So there's the QR code, and I put the link in the chat for feedback to get your PGP certificate. So I'll leave that there for a second. Then we also have a couple more sessions that are coming up. We've got one on February 7th, and that's going to be on Certificate of Completion Student of Support with Jennifer Phillips, who's the Director of Special Services at Wawasee, March 14th. Special Educator Wellness. We have 2 mental health therapists from Wawasee who are going to join us to talk about that. April 11th, we tentatively have a session on goal writing. That may change, but we'll get you more information. And then May 9th and June 13th, the Indiana Technical Assistance Center is going to join us to present on behavior plans and manifestation determination. So we'll push out links for registration, but there's a quick link for you to register for upcoming sessions. We only have up through March 14th on there. And again, here is the QR code for feedback and the link. Tracy, is there anything else I'm forgetting to share?
No, I don't think so. Other than we can give them like a sneak peek of the exciting news that we got this morning on high leverage practices. So look for information coming out from us on